She stood on the platform at Green River Station with one cloth bag and a secret that made her hands shake. She'd never let a man touch her in sleep, not since the night her first husband's kindness turned to fists. Now a telegram promised work, 2 motherless children, and a rancher who needed help. Nothing more. But when his eyes met hers across the dusty boards, something in his weathered face made her wonder if running west had brought her towards safety or into the one thing she'd sworn never to risk again. A man who might ask her to stay. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The train hissed and groaned to a stop, metal wheels screeching against iron rails as August heat shimmered off the tracks. Clara Brennan pressed her palm against the window glass, watching Wyoming territory unfold in shades of sage and dust. Her reflection stared back. 32 years old, dark hair pulled severe, eyes that had learned to guard everything they'd once given freely. Green River Station wasn't much. A weathered platform, a water tower casting long shadows, and a handful of buildings that looked like they'd been thrown up in a hurry and forgotten just as fast. Men in dusty hats moved cattle through distant pens. Somewhere a dog barked. The whole place smelled of creosote and possibility, or maybe just desperate hope disguised as a fresh start. Clara stood slowly, smoothing wrinkles from her gray traveling dress. The fabric was plain, practical, chosen specifically because it suggested competence without invitation. She'd learned that lesson the hard way, how men read a woman's clothes like a letter of intent, how a bit of lace or a lower neckline could rewrite your whole story before you'd spoken a word. Her bag sat between her boots, everything she owned compressed into one canvas satchel. 2 dresses. Undergarments mended so many times, the thread made patterns like tiny roads. A hairbrush with half its bristles missing. The deed to nothing, because she'd left Kansas with exactly what she'd arrived with, survival and not much else. The conductor appeared in the aisle, his face kind beneath the blue cap. "Green River, ma'am. End of the line for today." "Thank you." Clara's voice came out steady, which felt like a small miracle. Inside, her stomach twisted itself into knots that had nothing to do with the rocking train. She descended the steps carefully, boots meeting solid ground for the first time in 3 days. The platform trembled slightly, some ghost of motion still living in her legs. Around her, passengers dispersed like seeds in wind. A family reunited with shouts and embraces. A businessman strode toward a waiting carriage. An older woman was met by a young man who looked enough like her to be her son. Clara stood alone, scanning faces for someone who matched the brief description in the telegram. James Holloway, rancher. "We'll meet train August 12th. That was all she knew. That, and what the agency woman in Kansas City had told her with brutal efficiency. He lost his wife 2 winters back. Childbed fever, left him with a girl of 9 and a boy of 6. He needs someone to cook, clean, mind the children. Room and board, $30 a month. He's not looking for company, Mrs. Brennan. Just help." Clara had signed the papers that same afternoon. $30 was more than she'd seen in 6 months of taking in mending and doing laundry for women who treated her like she carried some contagious kind of failure. More than that, it was distance. Miles and miles between her and the farmhouse outside Lawrence, where she'd buried the version of herself that had believed in vows and second chances. "Mrs. Brennan." The voice came from her left, low, careful, like someone used to measuring words before spending them. Clara turned. The man stood perhaps 10 feet away, hat in hands, tall, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who worked with their bodies every day. His shirt had been clean that morning, but showed the day's labor and dust across the collar. Dark hair shot through with early gray, a face weathered by sun and wind and something heavier than weather. But it was his eyes that stopped her, brown, direct, holding a kind of exhaustion that went bone deep. Eyes that had seen things break and hadn't looked away. "Mr. Holloway." Clara kept her voice level, professional. She extended her hand for a shake, not a touch. His grip was brief, calloused, careful not to linger. "James, just James." He glanced at her single bag. "This all?" "It's enough." Something flickered across his face, understanding, maybe, or recognition. The kind that comes when you meet someone else who's learned to travel light because weight means commitment and commitment means risk. Wagon's just over here. He gestured toward a sturdy-looking rig hitched to two patient horses, then reached for her bag. Clara's hand tightened on the handle instinctively. James froze, reading the gesture for exactly what it was. I can carry it, she said quickly, hating how sharp she sounded. I'm used to managing. I imagine you are. He stepped back, giving her space. It's about an hour's drive to the ranch. We can stop if you need. They walked to the wagon in silence, boots crunching on gravel. Clara noticed things despite herself, the way he moved with deliberate economy, no wasted motion, the way he checked the horse's rigging with hands that knew their work, the way he waited until she'd settled herself on the wagon seat before climbing up beside her, leaving a careful foot of space between them. He clicked his tongue and the horses moved, pulling them away from the station and onto a rutted road that cut through endless sage. The town fell away behind them, swallowed by distance and dust. For a long while, neither spoke. Clara watched the landscape roll past. Low hills covered in scrub, distant mountains sharp against the sky, everything painted in shades of brown and gold and faded green. It was beautiful in a stark way, like something stripped down to its essential bones. The children, James said finally, his voice competing with the wagon wheels. Sarah's 9. Sharp as a tack, reads everything she can get her hands on. Helps with chores without being asked. He paused. Tommy's 6, quieter. Still adjusting. How long has it been? Clara asked, then wondered if she should have. Grief wasn't her business. She was here to work, not to excavate wounds. 2 years and 4 months. The precision told her everything. He counted days, probably, maybe hours. They need... He trailed off, jaw working like he was chewing words too tough to swallow. They need someone who'll stay. The emphasis landed heavy. Clara understood. He'd had help before, probably, women who'd looked at his situation and seen opportunity instead of children, women who'd wanted to slide into a dead wife's place and found the reality too hard or too lonely or too much like actual work. I'm here for the position you advertised, Clara said carefully. Cook, clean, mind the children. That's all I'm looking for. James glanced at her, something unreadable crossing his face. Good. That's good. They lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, less awkward, more like two people who'd established terms and could relax into them. The wagon rocked over uneven ground. Heat pressed down like a hand. Clara's dress stuck to her back with sweat, but the air smelled clean, sage and dust and something green she couldn't name. The house isn't much, James said after another mile. 3 rooms. Needs work I haven't had time for. You'll have your own space, Sarah's room. She'll bunk with Tommy for now. I don't want to displace, it's already decided. His tone was firm, but not unkind. You need privacy. That's not negotiable. Something in Clara's chest loosened slightly. Privacy, space, a door that locked from the inside. She hadn't dared hope for that much. The road wound through a narrow valley where a creek ran silver between rocks. Cottonwoods clustered along the water, their leaves whispering in the breeze. James guided the wagon across a shallow ford, water splashing up around the wheels. Another 20 minutes, he said. Clara nodded, her hands twisted together in her lap. Nerves started creeping in, the reality of what she'd agreed to settling over her like a coat that didn't quite fit. 2 children who'd lost their mother. A man who needed help but probably couldn't afford much softness. A house in the middle of nowhere, miles from any neighbor she could run to if... She cut the thought off hard. That wasn't fair. James Holloway hadn't done anything to deserve her fear except be male and need something from her. She couldn't spend her whole life measuring every man against the one who'd taught her that love was just another word for ownership. The ranch appeared gradually, like it was growing up out of the land itself. A simple house, wood frame painted white once, but weathered now to gray. A barn that looked sturdy despite its age. Corrals holding a few horses and some cattle. Garden patches gone a bit wild. Chickens scratching in the yard. And on the porch, 2 small figures waiting. Sarah stood straight-backed and serious, dark braids hanging over her shoulders, her dress clean but patched at the hem. Tommy half hid behind his sister, one hand fisted in her skirt, his face pale beneath a shock of brown hair. James pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. Sarah, Tommy, this is Mrs. Brennan. She's come to help. Clara climbed down carefully, smoothing her dress, trying to arrange her face into something warm but not desperate. Children saw through lies faster than anyone. Sarah stepped forward, her chin lifted. Hello, Mrs. Brennan. Papa said you'd teach us things. Did he? Clara glanced at James, who had the grace to look slightly sheepish. I thought, if you were willing, reading, writing, numbers. School's too far for regular attendance, and Sarah's already read through everything we've got twice over. I can do that. Clara turned back to Sarah, whose serious face had brightened just slightly. What are you reading now? David Copperfield. Papa brought it from town last month, but some of the words are hard. Dickens is always hard, Clara said, but worth the work. Maybe we can read it together, figure out the tricky parts. Tommy peeked out from behind his sister, his eyes enormous and dark. Clara crouched down slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. Hello, Tommy. I'm Clara. Your papa tells me you're good at helping with chores. The boy didn't answer, just stared at her with an expression that made her heart crack a little. He looked terrified and hopeful at the same time, like he wanted to believe she might stay but had learned better than to count on it. Come on, James said quietly. I'll show you the house. The interior was plain but clean. Someone had made an effort, though dust had gathered in the corners and the windows needed washing. The main room served as kitchen and living space, with a cast-iron stove, a scarred table, mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair near the fireplace. 2 doors led off to bedrooms. That one's mine, James indicated the left. Sarah and Tommy share the right. Yours now. Clara set her bag down carefully. The room was small but adequate. A narrow bed with a faded quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, hooks on the wall for hanging clothes, a window that looked out over the yard, and a latch on the door. Simple, iron, sturdy. I'll let you settle, James said from the doorway. Supper's usually around 6, nothing fancy, whatever I can manage after the day's work. I can cook, Clara said quickly. That's part of why I'm here. Not tonight. You've been traveling. He paused, his hand on the doorframe. The children will want to talk your ear off, probably. Sarah especially. Don't feel obliged to answer everything. You're entitled to your privacy. He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him. Clara stood in the middle of her new room, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere, Sarah's voice rose in a question. Tommy's smaller voice murmured something. James's lower tones responded, patient and tired. She was here. Actually here. Hundreds of miles from Kansas, standing in a stranger's house, responsible for children she'd just met, dependent on a man she knew nothing about except that he'd lost someone and needed help. Clara sank onto the bed, springs creaking beneath her. The quilt was soft, worn thin from years of use. Someone, James's wife probably, had stitched it by hand, tiny careful stitches making a pattern of stars and diamonds. A dead woman's quilt, a dead woman's room, a dead woman's children. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to shake. She'd made harder choices, survived worse situations. This was just work, just a job. She could keep her distance, do what was needed, collect her pay, and move on when the time came. The door rattled slightly, a knock, tentative. Mrs. Brennan? Sarah's voice, careful and polite. Clara stood quickly, smoothing her hair. Come in. The door opened to reveal both children. Sarah held Tommy's hand, her expression earnest. We wanted to show you where things are. Papa said we should let you rest, but Tommy thought you might want to know about the chickens. The chickens? Clara kept her voice gentle. Tommy nodded solemnly. They're mean, especially the red one. She pecks. Then I'll watch out for her. Clara moved toward them slowly. Why don't you show me? I've dealt with mean chickens before. They led her outside, Sarah chattering about the ranch, where the well was, how far to the creek, which horses were gentle and which to avoid. Tommy stayed quiet, but listened intently, occasionally tugging his sister's hand to point out something she'd missed. The chickens were indeed suspicious, eyeing Clara with predatory interest as she scattered feed from the bucket Sarah handed her. The red hen made a threatening move, and Clara shooed her back with practiced efficiency. "You're not scared," Tommy said, wonder in his voice. "Chickens are small," Clara said, "and they're more afraid of you than you are of them usually. You just have to show them you're not prey." "Mama was scared of them," Sarah said quietly. "She used to make Papa do the feeding." An awkward silence fell. Clara didn't know what to say, whether acknowledging the dead woman was appropriate or if it would make things worse. She settled for honesty. "Everyone's afraid of something. Your mama was brave about other things, I'm sure." "She had Tommy even though she was sick," Sarah said fiercely. "The doctor said it was dangerous, but she did it anyway. That's brave." "Yes," Clara agreed softly. "That's very brave." James appeared around the corner of the barn, carrying a bucket of water. He stopped when he saw them together, something crossing his face that Clara couldn't quite read. Not quite relief, not quite worry. Something in between. "Showing Mrs. Brennan the operation?" he called. "Tommy wanted her to know about the mean hen," Sarah called back. "Good thinking. That bird's got a temper." James set the bucket down near the horse trough. "Why don't you two go wash up for supper? I'll finish here." The children ran off toward the house, their voices fading. Clara stood in the dusty yard, suddenly aware that she was alone with James for the first time since they'd left the station. "They're good kids," she said to fill the silence. "They are." James straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sarah tries to be grown up too fast." "Tommy," he trailed off, his jaw tightening. "Tommy still cries for her at night. His mother. I don't know how to—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Sorry, that's not your burden." "I don't mind listening." Clara surprised herself by meaning it. "If you need to talk." "Talking doesn't change anything." His voice was flat, final. "Work does. Keeping them fed and safe and alive does. The rest is just noise." He walked past her toward the barn, shoulders set in a line that said the conversation was over. Clara watched him go, recognizing the shape of his grief because she'd worn her own the same way, like armor that had fused to skin, impossible to remove without bleeding. Supper was simple: salt pork, beans, cornbread that was a little burnt on the bottom. Sarah set the table with careful precision while Tommy filled cups with water from the pitcher. James ate methodically, answering Sarah's questions in brief sentences, occasionally redirecting Tommy's wandering attention back to his plate. Clara watched the rhythm of them, learning the patterns. The way James made sure the children ate before taking seconds himself. The way Sarah cut Tommy's meat without being asked. The way Tommy kept glancing at his father like he was checking to make sure he was still there. A family, Clara thought, broken and stitched back together imperfectly, but still a family. And she was the outsider, the hired help, here to fill practical gaps, but not emotional ones. That was fine. That was exactly what she wanted. After supper, Sarah insisted on showing Clara her books, a small collection on a shelf in the children's room. David Copperfield, a battered McGuffey's Reader, a Bible with a torn cover, and a few dime novels that looked well-thumbed. "Papa says reading's important," Sarah explained, running her fingers over the spines. "Mama used to read to us every night, but Papa's too tired now. He tries, but he falls asleep in the chair." "We could read together," Clara offered. "If your father agrees, before bed, maybe." Sarah's face lit up like someone had handed her Christmas morning. "Really? You do that?" "I like reading. It's no hardship." Tommy appeared in the doorway, his nightshirt hanging past his knees. "Will you read the one about the dog?" Sarah grabbed a thin book from the shelf, Beautiful Joe. "It's sad," she warned Clara, "but good sad. The kind that makes you feel things." Clara took the book carefully, its cover worn soft from handling. "How about we start tomorrow? Tonight you should sleep. You've had excitement enough." She helped Sarah tuck Tommy into the narrow bed they shared, the girl clearly used to the routine of getting her brother settled. When Tommy was buried under blankets despite the August heat, his eyes already drooping, Sarah whispered, "I'm glad you're here." "We'll see if you still feel that way after you've eaten my cooking," Clara said lightly, but something warm unfurled in her chest despite herself. Back in her own room, Clara lit the lamp and unpacked her meager belongings. 2 dresses hung on the wall hooks, undergarments folded into the chest, hairbrush on the washstand. The room looked barely more inhabited than when she'd arrived, but that was how she preferred it. No roots, no claims, no evidence that she belonged here beyond the practical. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "It's James." Clara opened the door carefully. James stood in the dim hallway, still dressed, though he'd rolled up his sleeves and his hair looked like he'd run his hands through it a few times. "I wanted to say, the children took to you. That's good. They've been through a lot of change." He shifted his weight. "The last woman who came lasted 3 weeks. Before that, my sister tried to help, but she's got her own family 2 counties over. It's been mostly just me trying to manage everything, and I'm not—" He stopped, jaw working. "I'm not very good at the parts that need softness." "You're keeping them alive and safe," Clara said quietly. "That's not nothing. It's not enough." The words came out rough, like they'd been stuck in his throat for months. "Sarah needs someone to talk to about girl things I don't understand. Tommy needs—" He looked away, blinking hard. "Tommy needs to stop being afraid all the time. He jumps at loud noises. Won't sleep unless Sarah's there. I don't know how to fix that." Clara recognized the helplessness in his voice. She'd heard it in her own, back when the world had narrowed to the width of her fear and she'd forgotten that living could mean anything besides surviving. "You can't fix it," she said gently. "You can just be steady while he heals. That's all anyone can do." James met her eyes then, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, maybe. The understanding of 2 people who'd both learned that some things break in ways that don't mend clean. "Well," he said finally, "I'll let you rest. Tomorrow starts early, chores around 5:30, but you should sleep late, get your bearings." "I'll be up at 5:30, Clara said firmly. "I'm here to work." He nodded slowly. "All right then. Good night, Mrs. Brennan." "Clara," she said before she could think better of it. "You can call me Clara." "Clara." He tested the name like it was something fragile. "Sleep well." He left, his footsteps fading toward his own room. Clara closed the door and turned the latch, listening to it click into place. Locked, safe, hers. She changed into her nightgown in the lamplight, then slid between sheets that smelled faintly of lavender. Someone had stored them with sachets, probably. The bed was harder than she was used to, but she'd slept on worse. Outside, night sounds drifted through the open window. Crickets. The distant call of an owl, horses shifting in the barn. And underneath it all, a vast silence that felt different from Kansas, bigger, emptier, full of space instead of memory. Clara closed her eyes and tried not to think about the morning, about settling into routine, about the way Sarah had looked at her with hope that felt too heavy to carry, about the exhaustion in James's voice when he'd admitted he wasn't enough, about Tommy's fear, which she recognized bone deep because she wore the same kind, just better hidden. She was here to work, to earn her pay, to keep her distance and her boundaries and her heart locked up as tight as the door. But as she drifted towards sleep, she couldn't quite silence the small, treacherous voice that whispered, "What if this time could be different?" She crushed the thought immediately, turning her face into the pillow. Different was dangerous. Different was how you got hurt. She'd learned that lesson written in bruises and broken promises, and she wasn't fool enough to forget it just because a man had kind eyes and children who needed her. This was temporary. Everything was temporary. She just had to remember that, and she'd be fine. Clara woke to darkness and the sound of roosters announcing dawn. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed felt wrong. The air smelled different. The silence had a quality she couldn't place. Then memory returned. Wyoming. The ranch. James Holloway and his children. She rose quickly, splashing water from the pitcher into the basin, the cold shocking her fully awake. Her reflection wavered in the small mirror above the washstand, pale, serious, hair tangled from sleep. She braided it efficiently, pinned it up, and dressed in her work dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better years but still had life in it. The house was quiet when she emerged. Through the window, she could see lamplight in the barn, James already at morning chores. Clara moved to the stove, finding it still warm from banking the night before. She built up the fire, filled the coffee pot from the water bucket, and began assembling breakfast from what she could find in the simple cupboards: flour, salt, lard. She mixed biscuit dough with practiced efficiency, her hands remembering the rhythm even though it had been months since she'd cooked for anyone but herself. Eggs from the crock, salt pork sliced thin. It wasn't fancy, but it was substantial, the kind of meal that would carry a working man through hard morning hours. She had biscuits in the oven and coffee boiling when Sarah appeared, barefoot and sleepy-eyed, her nightgown wrinkled. "You're up," the girl said, surprised. "I told your father I would be." Clara cracked eggs into the hot skillet, where they hissed and spat. "Is Tommy awake?" "Not yet. He sleeps heavy." Sarah moved closer, watching Clara work with the intensity of someone memorizing every motion. "Can I help?" "Set the table. Cups, plates, forks. Do you have jam or preserves?" "In the cellar. I'll get it." The girl disappeared through a door Clara hadn't explored yet, returning with a jar of what looked like choke cherry preserves, the fruit dark as garnets. "Mama made this. Last summer, before—" "Then we'll enjoy it in her honor," Clara said gently, and Sarah's face cleared slightly. They worked in companionable silence, Clara cooking and Sarah arranging things just so, moving around each other in the small space with surprising ease. When Tommy shuffled out rubbing his eyes, Sarah immediately redirected him to wash his face and hands, bossing him with the casual authority of an older sister who'd been doing it forever. James came in just as Clara was pulling the biscuits from the oven, bringing with him the smell of hay and animals and early morning work. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. The table set, food steaming, Clara at the stove, children already seated and waiting. "You didn't have to," he said quietly. "I'm here to cook, among other things." Clara set the plate of biscuits on the table. "Coffee's ready." They ate together as pale light strengthened outside, turning the windows from black to gray to gold. James was silent, focused on his food with the single-minded attention of a man who'd been up for hours already. Sarah chattered between bites, telling Clara about the chicken's individual personalities and which cow was due to calf soon. Tommy listened more than he spoke, but Clara noticed he cleaned his plate completely and took a second biscuit without prompting. "What needs doing today?" Clara asked when the meal was winding down. James looked up from his coffee, surprised by the directness. "I've got fence work in the north pasture." Sarah knows the routine: chickens, garden, general tidying. Tommy helps where he can. "I meant for me specifically." "The house needs a proper cleaning. I've been letting things slide. Laundry's piled up. Garden needs weeding, but you don't have to tackle everything at once. Easy into it." Clara heard what he wasn't saying. The last woman got overwhelmed and left. She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not afraid of work, James. I'd rather stay busy." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe. Or the beginning of trust. "All right, then. Sarah will show you where things are. I'll be back around noon to check the horses." He stood, settling his hat on his head, and paused by the door. "Breakfast was good. Better than good. Thank you." Then he was gone, his silhouette disappearing toward the barn. Clara began clearing dishes, but Sarah was already at her elbow with a dishcloth. "We wash in the basin," the girl explained. "Heat water on the stove first. Papa says we're lucky to have the well so close. Some ranches have to haul water for miles." They fell into a rhythm, Clara washing and Sarah drying, stacking plates on the shelf with careful precision. Tommy wandered outside to check on something, and in the quiet, Sarah said, "You're different from the others." "What others?" "The women who came before. Mrs. Hendricks lasted 2 weeks. She said the isolation made her nerves bad. And Miss Cartwright, she was nice at first, but then she kept trying to get Papa alone. To talk, she said. But Sarah's not stupid." Clara's hands stilled in the soapy water. "Your father told me what he needed. I'm here to do that work, nothing more." "Good." Sarah's voice was fierce, protective. "Papa doesn't need someone trying to replace Mama. He just needs help. And Tommy and me, we don't need a new Mama. We had one. She died, but she was ours, and nobody gets to just slide into her place like she never existed." The words hung in the kitchen, raw and honest. Clara dried her hands slowly, then crouched down so she was eye level with the girl. Your mama was yours, she said firmly. Nobody can replace her, and nobody should try. I'm here to cook and clean and help teach you things. That's all. You don't have to worry about me trying to be something I'm not. Sarah studied her face for a long moment, those sharp eyes reading for lies. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she nodded once, decisive. Okay, then I'll show you the garden. The morning unfolded in a series of tasks that Clara tackled with systematic efficiency. The garden was overgrown but salvageable. Tomatoes sprawling wild, beans climbing their poles in tangles, squash vines spreading like green rivers. She weeded while Sarah picked what was ripe, Tommy trailing behind with a basket that was almost too big for him to carry. The boy was quiet, but Clara noticed small things. The way he startled when a bird burst from the bushes, how he stayed close to his sister like she was a tether keeping him from drifting away. When a bee buzzed near his head, he froze completely, face going white. It's all right, Clara said softly, not moving toward him. Stand still and it'll go past. Bees only sting when they're scared. Tommy stood like a statue until the bee wandered off toward the flowers. Then he let out a shaky breath, his small hands trembling. You did well, Clara told him. Standing still when you're frightened is one of the hardest things a person can do. Mama got stung once, he whispered. She cried. Stings hurt. Your mama was right to cry if it hurt. Papa said big boys don't cry. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't know what had prompted that particular piece of wisdom from James, but she disagreed with it thoroughly. Your papa was wrong about that. Everybody cries. Men, women, children. It's just feeling things, and feelings aren't something to be ashamed of. Sarah looked up sharply from the tomato plants, something grateful crossing her face. Tommy just blinked at Clara, processing this information like it was a foreign language he'd never encountered. They worked until the sun was high and hot, then retreated to the house with baskets of vegetables and dirt under their fingernails. Clara set Sarah to snapping beans while she tackled the laundry, hauling water and heating it in the big copper pot, scrubbing shirts and trousers and linens against the washboard until her shoulders ached. Hanging the washing on the line stretched between two posts, she caught sight of James in the distance, working on a section of fence with methodical determination. Even from here, she could see the set of his shoulders, the weight he carried in every movement. A man holding things together through sheer, stubborn will. By noon, Clara had bread rising, beans simmering with salt pork, and potatoes peeled for roasting. When James came in for the midday meal, he stopped in the doorway again, taking in the transformation. Floors swept, surfaces wiped down, laundry flapping white in the breeze outside. You've been busy, he said, something like wonder in his voice. I told you I would be. Clara ladled beans into bowls. Sit, you need to eat. They ate together again, and this time James asked Sarah about her reading, listening patiently while she explained the plot complications of David Copperfield. Tommy ate quietly, but Clara noticed he kept glancing at her, like he was still trying to figure out if she was real or if she'd disappear like the others had. After the meal, James lingered while Clara cleaned up. The children seem settled with you. That's more than I'd hoped for so fast. They're good children. They make it easy. They're grieving children, James corrected quietly. Nothing about that's easy. Clara rinsed a plate, choosing her words carefully. Grief doesn't make someone bad. Just hurt. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment, then said, My wife, Anna, she was soft with them in ways I'm not. Patient. She knew how to talk to them about feelings and fears and all the things I'm no good at. I can teach them to work, to be responsible, to survive. But the rest? He trailed off, frustrated. You're doing better than you think, Clara said, and meant it. They're fed, clothed, safe. They know you love them. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Maybe enough is just doing the next right thing, and then the next one after that. Maybe it doesn't have to be perfect to matter. James looked at her then, really looked, and Clara felt suddenly exposed, like he was seeing past the careful walls she'd built and glimpsing the person underneath who understood grief and inadequacy and the desperate hope that simply not failing counted as success. I should get back to the fence, he said finally, but his voice was gentler. Thank you for the meal, for everything. After he left, Clara stood at the window watching him walk back toward the north pasture, his gait steady despite the limp she'd noticed he tried to hide. Sarah appeared at her elbow. "He got hurt when Mama died," the girl said quietly, following Clara's gaze. "He was working too hard, trying to do everything himself, and a horse kicked him. Doctor said he was lucky it wasn't worse, but it still pains him when the weather changes. He should rest it more. Papa doesn't know how to rest. He just knows how to work until he can't think anymore." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but underneath it Clara heard worry. This child had already learned to take care of her father emotionally, carrying burdens no 9-year-old should have to lift. The afternoon passed in more work, Clara teaching Sarah how to make proper bread, kneading the dough while the girl watched and asked questions. Tommy played quietly in the corner with a set of carved wooden animals, occasionally bringing one over to show Clara before retreating back to his corner. When the heat became oppressive, Clara suggested they take a break by the creek. Sarah's face lit up, and even Tommy looked interested. They walked down through the cottonwoods, the temperature dropping in the shade, and found a spot where the water ran clear over smooth stones. Sarah waded in immediately, dress hitched up, splashing and laughing. Tommy was more cautious, staying on the bank until Clara sat down beside him and dangled her own feet in the current. "It's cold," she said conversationally, "but it feels good after all that heat." Tommy considered this, then slowly, carefully, removed his boots and rolled up his trousers. He sat beside Clara and lowered his feet into the water, gasping at the cold. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he watched the current rush around his ankles, his face thoughtful. "Mama used to bring us here," he said suddenly. "She liked the sound of the water." "It's a peaceful sound," Clara agreed, not pushing, just listening. She said it was like singing, like the creek was singing a song that never ended. His voice was wistful, distant. "Do you think she can still hear it, where she is now?" Clara's throat tightened. She didn't believe in easy platitudes about heaven and angels, didn't think death was something you could wrap up in pretty words and ribbons. But this boy needed something, and she couldn't give him nothing. "I think the people we love stay with us in different ways," she said carefully. "In memories, in the things they taught us, in places they loved that we still visit. Maybe your mama can't hear the creek anymore, but you can. And when you hear it, you think of her. That's a kind of keeping her close, isn't it?" Tommy thought about this, his small face serious. Then he nodded, just once, and went back to watching the water flow around his feet. They stayed at the creek until the sun started to lower, then walked back to the house in the golden afternoon light. Clara started supper while Sarah set the table and Tommy, without being asked, brought in firewood for the stove. James came in as the sun was setting, dust-covered and tired, his shirt dark with sweat. He washed at the basin, scrubbing his hands and face, then sat at the table with a heaviness that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion. Supper was quiet: roasted potatoes, the last of the salt pork, fresh bread with butter and preserves. James ate mechanically, his eyes half closed. When Tommy knocked over his cup, spilling water across the table, James just reached for a cloth without comment, sopping it up while Sarah rushed to help. "Papa?" Sarah said hesitantly. "Mrs. Brennan, Clara, said she'd read to us tonight. If that's all right." James looked up, focusing on his daughter with effort. "That's fine. That's good." After supper, Clara shooed James toward the rocking chair while she cleaned up. He protested weakly, but she could see he was dead on his feet, so she simply ignored his objections and finished the work herself. By the time she was done, he was asleep in the chair, his head tilted back, breathing deep and even. The children got ready for bed on their own, clearly used to the routine. When they were in their night clothes, Clara brought beautiful Joe into their room and sat on the edge of the bed. Sarah scooted over to make room, and Tommy curled up on his sister's other side, his thumb creeping toward his mouth before he caught himself and pulled it away. Clara began to read, her voice low and steady, bringing the story to life. It was sad, a dog's tale of cruelty and rescue and the kindness that could heal even the deepest wounds. Tommy's eyes grew wide and wet. Sarah listened with fierce attention, her hands fisted in the quilt. When Clara reached a particularly difficult part, the dog's early suffering, Tommy made a small sound of distress. Sarah immediately wrapped an arm around him, and Clara paused. "Should I stop?" she asked gently. "No," Sarah said. It gets better. It has to get better. So Clara kept reading until she reached a natural stopping point, a place where the dog had found safety at least temporarily. She closed the book and set it aside. Tomorrow we'll read more, she promised. But for now, sleep. Clara? Tommy's voice was small in the dimness. Do all sad things get better? The question hung in the air, weighted with everything this boy had lost. Clara could have lied, could have given him the easy answer, but she'd promised herself she wouldn't lie to these children. Not all things get better, she said quietly. Some things just hurt, and we learn to carry them. But even in the middle of hurt, there can be good things too, small things, a creek song, fresh bread, a story read by lamplight. Those things matter. They don't erase the hurt, but they live alongside it. Tommy considered this, then nodded slowly. Sarah reached over and squeezed Clara's hand once, quick and fierce, before pulling back. Clara left them tucked under their quilt and returned to the main room. James was still asleep in the chair, his face relaxed in a way it never was while waking. She stood there for a moment, uncertain. She could wake him, send him to his own bed, or she could let him sleep. He clearly needed it desperately. She compromised by draping a light blanket over him, careful not to touch him beyond what was necessary. He stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible, but didn't wake. In her own room, Clara prepared for bed in the lamplight, braiding her hair loose, changing into her nightgown. Through the wall, she could hear the children's voices, low and drowsy, talking about something she couldn't make out. Then silence, settling like snow. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the day. How strange it was to slip into the rhythms of other people's lives. How the house was beginning to feel less foreign, the children less like strangers. How James's exhaustion had stirred something in her chest that felt dangerously like caring. She couldn't afford to care. Caring meant attachment, and attachment meant pain when things inevitably fell apart. She was here to work, to earn her way, to save enough money to eventually move on to some place where she could be truly independent, beholden to no one. But even as she reminded herself of these facts, she couldn't quite silence the warmth that had bloomed when Tommy had asked his question, when Sarah had squeezed her hand, when James had thanked her with such genuine gratitude in his voice. Tomorrow she'd be more careful, more guarded. She'd do her work without letting it become personal. Tomorrow. Tonight, she let herself acknowledge that she'd enjoyed the day, that the children's trust felt like something precious, that the rhythm of cooking and cleaning and caring for others had satisfied something in her she'd thought was dead. But only for tonight, only in the darkness and privacy of her own thoughts. By morning, she'd remember who she was and why she'd come here. She'd rebuild her walls and keep her distance and remember that safety meant never letting anyone close enough to hurt her. She almost believed it. The next days fell into patterns that felt deceptively like permanence. Clara rose before dawn, started breakfast, managed the household tasks with efficient precision. Sarah helped eagerly, soaking up every bit of knowledge Clara offered, how to make biscuits that rose light, how to test bread dough, how to get stains out of fabric, how to preserve vegetables for winter. Tommy remained quieter, but Clara noticed small changes. He started bringing her things, a smooth stone from the creek, a feather he'd found, a wildflower whose name he didn't know. He'd present these offerings without words, watching her face to see if they pleased her. Clara treated each one like treasure, setting them on the windowsill in her room where morning light made them glow. James worked from before sunrise to after sunset, pushing himself with relentless determination. Clara started packing him a midday meal so he wouldn't have to come back to the house, and he'd thank her briefly before disappearing back to whatever task consumed him that day. She watched him, though she tried not to. Watched the way he was patient with the children, even when exhausted. The way he never raised his voice, even when Tommy spilled things or Sarah asked the same question 3 times. The way he'd pause sometimes in the middle of work, staring at nothing, his face carved with grief so raw it made her chest ache. One evening, almost a week after her arrival, Claire was washing dishes when James came in earlier than usual, favoring his bad leg more than normal. He sank into a chair with a barely suppressed groan. "Leg bothering you?" Clara asked, keeping her voice neutral. "It's nothing, just overdid it today." Clara dried her hands and moved to the cupboard where she'd noticed a tin of liniment. "Where exactly does it hurt?" "Clara, you don't need to." Where, James? He sighed, recognizing that she wasn't going to let it go. Above the knee, mostly. Sometimes the hip. Can you show me? Through the fabric? He indicated the area, his jaw tight with what she suspected was embarrassment as much as pain. Clara knelt in front of him, professional and matter-of-fact, working the liniment through the fabric of his trousers. She could feel the tension in the muscle, the old injury that had healed poorly. You should rest it more, she said quietly. Can't afford to rest. Work doesn't stop for aches and pains. Work won't matter if you cripple yourself permanently. He was quiet for a moment, then said, Anna used to say the same thing. Clara's hands stilled. This was the first time he'd mentioned his wife directly to her. She was right. She was right about a lot of things. His voice was heavy with memory. She wanted me to hire more help, to not carry everything alone, but I was stubborn, thought I could handle it all myself, and then she got sick and I couldn't. He stopped, his throat working. Clara sat back on her heels, giving him space. You can't undo the past. You can only learn from it. That's what everyone says. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. He looked down at her, his expression raw. Some days I'm so angry at her for leaving, and then I hate myself for being angry because it wasn't her fault. She didn't choose to die. She just did. Grief isn't logical, Clara said softly. You can love someone and be angry at them at the same time. You can miss them and resent them and wish they were here and wish you could let them go all in the same breath. That's just being human. How do you know? The question was direct, searching. You talk like someone who's lived it. Clara stood, capping the liniment, creating distance. Everyone's lived something, James. We all carry our own ghosts. She felt his eyes on her as she moved back to the sink, but he didn't push. Instead, he said, Thank you for the liniment, for listening. It's nothing. It's not nothing to me. The words settled between them, meaning more than they should. Clara focused on the dishes, on the simple task of cleaning, and didn't let herself think about why his gratitude made her feel warm and terrified all at once. That night, reading to the children, Tommy fell asleep mid-story, his head heavy against Sarah's shoulder. Sarah herself was drowsing, fighting to keep her eyes open. Clara marked the page and stood quietly, but before she could leave, Sarah whispered, Clara, are you going to stay? I'm here as long as I'm needed, Clara said carefully. That's not what I asked. Sarah's eyes were serious, too knowing for 9 years old. The others said they'd stay too, but they left. Clara crouched beside the bed, meeting the girl's gaze directly. I won't lie to you, Sarah. I don't know what the future holds, but I can promise you this. I won't leave without telling you first. I won't just disappear. You have my word on that. Sarah studied her face, then nodded slowly. Okay, that's fair. It was fair, Clara thought as she returned to her own room. It was also the most commitment she'd made to anyone in 2 years, and the fact that she'd made it to a 9-year-old girl in Wyoming territory felt both absurd and somehow completely right. She was in dangerous territory. She could feel herself softening, the walls she'd built beginning to crack. But she didn't know how to stop it without being cruel, and cruelty toward these grieving children felt like a sin she couldn't commit. So she'd stay careful, stay guarded, do her work without losing herself in it. She just had to remember that these weren't her children, this wasn't her home. And James Holloway, with his kind eyes and his quiet strength and his bone-deep grief that matched her own, wasn't hers either, no matter how much some small, reckless part of her was starting to wish he could be. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, rolling down from the mountains like something alive and angry. Clara had been in the garden with Sarah, teaching her how to tie up tomato plants that were threatening to collapse under their own weight, when the wind shifted suddenly, going from gentle breeze to violent gusts in the span of a breath. Inside, Clara said sharply, grabbing the basket of vegetables they'd picked. Now! They ran for the house, Sarah calling for Tommy, who'd been playing near the barn. The boy appeared around the corner, eyes wide with fear as the sky turned greenish-black above them. Thunder rolled across the valley like cannon fire, and the first drops of rain hit fat and cold against Clara's face. They made it through the door just as the deluge started, rain coming down so hard it sounded like gravel thrown against the roof. Lightning cracked bright enough to leave afterimages, and Tommy made a small sound of terror, pressing himself against the wall. "It's all right," Clara said, though her own heart was hammering. She'd seen storms like this in Kansas, the kind that could spawn twisters or hail big enough to kill livestock. "Sarah, help me close the shutters." They moved through the house, securing windows while the storm raged outside, the world disappearing behind curtains of rain. Clara lit lamps against the premature darkness, trying to create some sense of normalcy even as thunder shook the floorboards beneath their feet. "Where's Papa?" Tommy's voice was small, barely audible over the storm's roar. Clara's stomach clenched. James had ridden out to check the far pasture that morning, said he'd be back by early afternoon. But it was past 3 now, and he wasn't here, which meant he was caught somewhere in this fury. "He knows how to take care of himself," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. "He'll find shelter and wait it out." Another crack of thunder, this one so close the lamp flames jumped and wavered. Tommy whimpered and bolted across the room, not to Sarah, but to Clara, wrapping his arms around her waist and burying his face against her stomach. His whole body shook. Clara froze for just a moment. This was the first time the boy had willingly touched her. Then slowly, carefully, she wrapped her arms around him and held on. "You're safe," she murmured. "I've got you." Sarah moved closer too, her face pale but set with determination. "Mama hated storms. She used to hide in the root cellar." "Your mama was smart to know her fears and how to manage them," Clara said. "There's no shame in being frightened of things that can actually hurt you." Lightning and thunder came simultaneously, so loud it felt like the sky was tearing open. Tommy's grip tightened until it hurt, but Clara didn't pull away. She just held him, one hand stroking his hair, murmuring reassurances that she half believed herself. The storm battered the house for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Gradually, the thunder grew more distant, the lightning less frequent, the rain easing from torrential to merely heavy. Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but Tommy didn't let go. "It's passing," she told him gently. "The worst is over." "Promise?" His voice was muffled against her dress. "I promise. Listen, can you hear how the thunder's getting farther away?" He lifted his head slightly, listening, and she felt him nod. But he still didn't release her, and Clara didn't push him to. Instead, she guided him to the rocking chair and sat down, letting him curl up in her lap, even though he was really too big for it. Sarah pressed close against the chair's arm, and Clara hummed something low and wordless while the storm finished its tantrum and moved on toward the eastern plains. When the rain finally stopped, the silence felt shocking. Clara could hear water dripping from the eaves, a bird tentatively calling, the creak of the house settling, and underneath it all, hoofbeats. She looked up sharply as Sarah ran to the window. "Papa's coming!" Clara eased Tommy off her lap and moved to the door, opening it to reveal a world washed clean and dripping. James rode into the yard soaked to the bone, his hat long gone, his horse mud-splattered and tired. He dismounted stiffly and led the animal toward the barn. "Stay here," Clara told the children, then stepped out onto the porch. James emerged from the barn a few minutes later, walking with a pronounced limp. His shirt was plastered to his body, his hair dripping water down his face. When he saw Clara waiting, something in his expression shifted, relief and exhaustion, and something raw. "You're all right," he said, more statement than question. "We're fine. You're the one who was caught out in it." Got to the line shack about 5 minutes before it hit, waited it out there. He climbed the porch steps slowly, and Clara could see he was shivering despite the warmth. "The children?" "Frightened, but safe. Tommy especially." James's face tightened with guilt. "I should have been here." "You couldn't have known. Come inside. You need dry clothes before you catch your death." She herded him into the house where Sarah and Tommy immediately swarmed him, relief making them bold. James hugged them both, getting them wet in the process, but nobody seemed to care. When he finally released them, he looked at Clara over their heads. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being here, for keeping them calm." "It's what I'm here for," Clara said, but the words felt inadequate for what had actually passed between her and the children during those terrifying minutes. James changed into dry clothes while Clara heated soup and sliced bread, the children hovering close to their father like they were afraid he might disappear if they let him out of sight. Over supper, James described the storm from his perspective, the way it had come down the mountain like a wall, the hail that had thankfully been small, the lightning strike that had split a dead tree not 50 yards from the shack. "I kept thinking about you three here," he admitted, his voice rough. "Hoping you were managing all right, hoping the house would hold." "The house is solid," Clara said, "and we managed fine." But Tommy shook his head, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was scared, Papa, really scared. The thunder was so loud and the lightning kept flashing, and I thought maybe—" He couldn't finish, but James understood. He reached across the table and took his son's small hand. "I'm here now. I'm all right. We're all right." "Clara held me," Tommy said, the words tumbling out. "When I was scared, she held me and didn't let go, even when I held on too tight." James's eyes found Clara's across the table, and something passed between them. An understanding, a recognition. She'd crossed a line today, had let these children matter to her in a way that went beyond professional duty, and James knew it. "Then I'm grateful to her," he said simply. "Sometimes holding on is exactly what someone needs." That night, both children wanted Clara to read to them, but Tommy asked for something different. "Can you stay? After we fall asleep? Just for a little while?" Clara glanced at Sarah, who nodded quickly. "Sometimes we get scared at night, after storms especially." "I'll stay," Clara promised, and saw relief wash across both their faces. She read longer than usual, until both children were drowsing, their breathing deep and even. Then she sat in the growing darkness, watching them sleep, feeling something in her chest that was tender and terrifying all at once. These weren't her children. She had no claim to them, no right to the fierce protectiveness that had flared in her when Tommy had clung to her during the storm. But feeling it and stopping it were two different things. When she finally emerged from their room, she found James still up, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him. He looked up when she appeared, his face drawn with exhaustion. "They asleep?" he asked. Finally, Tommy especially needed the reassurance. James nodded slowly. "He hasn't let anyone comfort him like that since Anna died. Not even me. He pulls away when I try. But with you today—" He trailed off, emotion thick in his voice. Clara sat down across from him, uncertain but compelled by something she couldn't name. "Children know who's safe. Maybe I just happened to be what he needed in that moment. Or maybe you're better at this than you think you are." James turned his cup in slow circles. "I heard what you told him, about being scared of things that can actually hurt you, about feelings not being shameful. Anna used to say things like that. I never knew how. I'm not good at the soft parts. You're good at showing up, at being steady. That's its own kind of softness." He looked at her then, really looked, and Clara felt exposed under that gaze, like he was seeing past her careful walls to the broken places she'd worked so hard to hide. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. "Before you came here?" Clara's throat tightened. She could deflect, could give him some sanitized version that didn't include the truth. But sitting here in the lamplight with this man who'd been nothing but kind and honest, she found she didn't want to lie. "I was married," she said slowly. "Back in Kansas. To a man who seemed decent at first, charming even. But after the wedding, things changed. He wanted—" She stopped, the words catching. "He wanted a wife he could control, own. When I didn't behave the way he expected, he'd remind me of my place." James's hands curled into fists on the table, but he didn't interrupt. "It took me 2 years to leave. 2 years of telling myself it would get better, that I just needed to try harder, be quieter, take up less space. Until the night he—" Her voice cracked. "Until I realized that staying meant dying, one way or another. So I left. Divorced him, which meant I became a scandal. A woman who'd failed at the one thing women are supposed to be good at." "You didn't fail," James said fiercely. "He did. Any man who raises a hand to a woman has failed at being human, let alone being a husband." Clara's eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. "The point is, I learned not to trust easily, not to let people close. It's safer that way." "Safer," James echoed, "but lonelier. Loneliness doesn't leave bruises." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of what she'd confessed hanging between them. Then James said, "I won't ask you for more than you can give, Clara, but I want you to know you're safe here. You and your boundaries and your careful walls. Whatever you need to feel secure, you'll have it." Something in Clara's chest cracked open just slightly. "Why are you being so kind to me?" "Because you're being kind to my children. Because you work harder than anyone I've ever met and never complain. Because you held my son when he was terrified and gave him exactly what he needed." He paused. "And because I recognize the look in your eyes. The one that says you've survived something that should have broken you, but somehow didn't. I see that look in my own mirror sometimes." Clara wiped at her eyes, angry at herself for the tears that had escaped. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? Both carrying ghosts. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe it means we understand each other." The moment stretched, fragile and honest, until Clara couldn't bear the intensity of it anymore. She stood, smoothing her dress with shaking hands. "I should sleep. Tomorrow's another early morning." "Clara." James stood too. "Thank you for trusting me with your story. I know that wasn't easy." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and retreated to her room. Behind the closed door, she leaned against the wall, her heart racing. She told him the things she'd sworn never to share with anyone, the shameful truth of her first marriage and what it had cost her. And he hadn't judged, hadn't blamed, hadn't suggested she had deserved it or brought it on herself. He just listened and believed and offered her safety. It was the most dangerous kind of kindness, the kind that made you want to lean into it, the kind that made you forget why you'd built walls in the first place. Clara pushed away from the door and prepared for bed mechanically, trying not to think about James's eyes or his words, or the way something in her wanted desperately to trust that his promise of safety was real. The days that followed took on a different quality, like something had shifted in the foundation of their small household. Tommy started seeking Clara out more, bringing her small treasures, asking her questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether she thought his mama could see them from heaven. Clara answered honestly, never talking down to him, and watched him slowly unfold like a flower that had been afraid to bloom. Sarah grew more confident in the kitchen, taking pride in her developing skills. She started planning meals with Clara, suggesting combinations and learning to trust her own instincts. The girl had a quick mind and deft hands, and Clara found herself genuinely enjoying the teaching. James watched these transformations quietly, his expression often unreadable, but his gratitude evident in small gestures, bringing Clara wildflowers he'd found while working, fixing the wobbly leg on her chair without being asked, making sure she had the best pieces of meat at supper. One evening after the children were asleep, Clara was mending a tear in one of James's shirts when he came and sat across from her, an unusual tension in his posture. "I need to make a supply run to Green River tomorrow," he said. "It'll take most of the day. I'd like to bring Sarah. She needs new boots and a winter coat, and she should pick them herself. But that means leaving you here alone with Tommy." "That's fine," Clara said, focusing on her stitching. "We'll manage." "It's not that I don't trust you. It's just Tommy gets anxious when I'm gone, and he's been doing so much better lately, I don't want to set him back." Clara looked up, meeting his worried gaze. "James, I held him through a thunderstorm. I think I can manage a day. Tommy and I will find things to occupy ourselves." He relaxed slightly. "You're right. I just worry." "That's what parents do," Clara said gently. "Worry is just love in uncomfortable shoes." James smiled at that, a real smile that changed his whole face, making him look younger and less burdened. "Anna used to say something similar. She'd tell me I worried too much, that the children would sense it and start worrying too. She was right about that. She was right about most things." His voice softened. "I think she would have liked you." The comment landed unexpectedly, making Clara's chest tight. "You can't know that." "I can, actually. She always said what I needed was someone who wouldn't try to fix me, just someone who'd be steady while I figured things out myself. That's what you've been, for me and for the children." Clara set down her mending, her hands suddenly unsteady. "I'm just doing my job, James." "No, you're not. You're doing more than anyone has a right to expect." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "You care about them, about Sarah and Tommy. I can see it in how you look at them, how you talk to them. That's not just a job. Caring doesn't mean... Clara stopped, not sure what she was trying to say. I know, James said quietly. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I see it, and I'm grateful. They sat in silence for a moment, Clara's needle poised over the fabric, James watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he stood, stretching his bad leg carefully. We'll leave early tomorrow. There's enough wood chopped for the stove, and I'll bring in extra water before we go. If anything happens, nothing will happen, Clara interrupted firmly. We'll be fine. Stop borrowing trouble. He nodded, but she could see the worry still etched in his face. A father's worry, born of loss and the terrible knowledge that bad things could happen despite your best efforts to prevent them. The next morning dawned clear and cool, autumn's first whisper in the air. James and Sarah left just after sunrise, Sarah excited about the trip despite the early hour. Tommy watched them go from the porch, his hand in Clara's, his face solemn. It's just us today, Clara said, when the wagon had disappeared from sight. What should we do first? Tommy thought about it seriously. Can we make cookies? Mama used to make cookies sometimes. We can absolutely make cookies. Do you remember what kind? Sugar cookies, with cinnamon on top. They spent the morning in the kitchen, Tommy standing on a chair beside Clara while she guided him through measuring and mixing. He was meticulous, counting each cup of flour carefully, stirring with intense concentration. When they cut out shapes and arranged them on the baking sheet, his face glowed with pride. While the cookies baked, filling the house with warmth and sweetness, Tommy asked, Clara, can I tell you something? Of course. I was scared when you first came. I thought maybe you'd be like Miss Cartwright. She smiled a lot, but it didn't reach her eyes. Papa says eyes don't lie. Clara crouched down to his level. And what do my eyes say? Tommy studied her face seriously. They're sad sometimes, but they're kind, and they don't lie. He paused. Are you going to leave like the others did? The question pierced her. Clara took a breath, choosing her words carefully. I told Sarah I wouldn't leave without saying goodbye first. I'm telling you the same thing. Whatever happens, I won't just disappear on you. You have my word. But you might leave someday. Someday, maybe. But not today. Not tomorrow. When people make big changes, they usually have good reasons and time to prepare. There'd be warning, Tommy. You wouldn't wake up one morning and find me gone. He nodded slowly, processing this. Then he did something that made Clara's heart stop. He wrapped his arms around her neck and hugged her tight. I'm glad you're here now, he whispered. Clara hugged him back, blinking hard against tears. I'm glad I'm here too. They ate warm cookies for lunch, washing them down with cold milk, and Tommy's laughter when he got cinnamon sugar on his nose was worth every careful boundary Clara was letting slip. The afternoon passed in easy companionship. They walked to the creek and Tommy showed her all his favorite spots. The rocks that were perfect for skipping, the pool where he'd seen a trout, the tree his papa said was good for climbing when he got bigger. He talked more than Clara had ever heard him talk, words spilling out like he'd been saving them up. When the sun started lowering, they headed back to the house to start supper. Tommy helped peel potatoes, telling Clara about his mama, how she'd sung while she worked, how she'd let him help make bread even though he always made a mess, how she'd smelled like lavender and sunshine. Do you miss her? Clara asked gently. Every day, Tommy said simply. But it doesn't hurt as much as it used to. Sarah says that's normal, that missing someone can feel different as time goes on. Sarah's right about that. Do you miss someone? The question was direct, childlike in its lack of guile. Clara thought about her answer. I miss who I used to be before I learned to be afraid. Does that make sense? Tommy nodded seriously. I think so. Like you're missing yourself? Exactly like that. They worked in comfortable silence after that, and Clara marveled at this boy's capacity for understanding things that shouldn't make sense to someone his age. Grief had aged him in some ways, but it had also made him more empathetic, more attuned to other people's pain. James and Sarah returned just as Clara was setting supper on the table. Sarah burst through the door full of excitement about her new boots and coat, while James carried packages and looked pleased despite his evident exhaustion. How was your day? He asked Clara, his eyes searching her face. Good. Tommy and I made cookies and talked and went to the creek. We managed just fine. We made cookies, Tommy announced proudly. I measured everything myself. Sarah immediately wanted to try one, and the evening dissolved into the pleasant chaos of a family sharing a meal and stories. But Clara noticed James watching her throughout, something warm and wondering in his expression that made her nervous and hopeful in equal measure. Later, after the children were asleep, James found Clara on the porch where she'd gone to get some air. The night was cool, stars brilliant overhead, the kind of sky you only got this far from cities and their lights. Tommy talked about you all the way home, James said, leaning against the porch rail. According to Sarah, he wouldn't stop. Clara did this? Clara said that. Clara showed me. She was about ready to throttle him by the end. Clara smiled despite herself. He's a sweet boy. He's a boy who's healing, thanks to you. James's voice was serious now. When Anna died, he just shut down. Stopped talking much, stopped playing, stopped being a child. I didn't know how to reach him, but you reached him without even trying. I wasn't trying, Clara admitted. I was just being honest with him. Children know when you're pretending. That's what makes you good at this. You don't pretend. He paused. Clara, I know I said I wouldn't ask for more than you can give, but I need to say something, and I need you to just listen without feeling obligated to respond. Clara's heart started hammering, but she nodded. You've been here almost 3 weeks, and in that time you've brought something back to this house that I thought died with Anna. Not her replacement. Nothing could replace her. But hope, maybe. The sense that life can be more than just surviving. He took a breath. The children love you. I can see it in how they look at you, how they seek you out. And He stopped, swallowed hard. I'm grateful for you. More than grateful. You make me remember that there are good people in the world, kind people, people who've been hurt but haven't let it make them cruel. Claire's throat was tight, her eyes burning. James? I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I just needed you to know that you matter. Here, to us. You matter. The words hung in the night air, honest and terrifying and precious. Clara wanted to run, to rebuild her walls, to retreat to safety, but she also wanted to stay exactly where she was, standing on this porch, with this man who saw her and valued her and asked for nothing except her presence. You matter too, she whispered finally. All of you. More than I meant to let you. James smiled, sad and understanding. Life has a way of mattering whether we mean it to or not. They stood together in the darkness, not touching but somehow connected. Two broken people learning tentatively to trust that maybe broken things could still hold something whole. September arrived with frost on the grass and the knowledge that winter was no longer a distant threat, but an approaching certainty. Clara woke one morning to find ice crystals on the inside of her window, delicate ferns of frozen moisture that melted under her fingertips. The beauty of it couldn't quite mask the practical concern. If frost was reaching inside the house already, the cold months ahead would be brutal. She found James at the breakfast table, studying a list he'd written in his careful, blocky handwriting. Supply needs, she realized, reading upside down. Flour, salt, kerosene nails, wool blankets, preserving jars. Getting ready for winter? She asked, starting the coffee. Trying to. It comes hard and fast out here. 1 week you're fine, the next you're snowed in for days at a time. He looked up, his face serious. I need to know if you're planning to stay through it. Winter changes things. It's isolated, sometimes brutal. If you're thinking about leaving, now's the time, before the roads become impassable. The question landed heavy between them. Clara poured water into the coffee pot, buying time to think. She'd been here a month now. A month of cooking and cleaning and teaching the children. A month of watching James work himself to exhaustion. A month of carefully constructed boundaries that were becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. A month of feeling like maybe, just maybe, she'd found something worth the risk of staying. Are you asking me to leave? She said quietly. No. The word was immediate, almost fierce. I'm asking if you want to. There's a difference. Clara turned to face him, leaning against the counter. What happens if I stay? Practically speaking. You'd be here through March, at least. Maybe April, depending on the snowpack. You'd be snowed in with us, sharing close quarters, managing on limited supplies. It's not easy, Clara. People go a little crazy from the isolation sometimes. And if I go? His jaw tightened. Then I'd respect that choice and be grateful for the time you gave us. But the children would be devastated, Tommy especially. He paused. And I'd miss you, your presence, your help, your... He stopped himself, shaking his head. I'd miss you. Sarah chose that moment to appear, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Miss who? James and Clara both startled, the intensity of the moment broken. Nobody, James said quickly. Just talking about winter plans. But Sarah was too sharp to be fooled. Her eyes moved between them, reading the tension. Clara's staying, isn't she? She promised she wouldn't leave without telling us first. I did promise that, Clara said carefully. And I keep my promises. So you're staying? Sarah's voice held so much hope it hurt. Clara looked at James, then back at Sarah. The smart thing would be to leave now before she got any more tangled in these people's lives. Before the boundaries she'd built became completely meaningless. Before she started wanting things she'd sworn never to want again. But Tommy had held her hand yesterday while they'd checked the chickens, his small fingers trusting in hers. Sarah had asked her opinion about a story she was writing, valuing Clara's input like it mattered. James had looked at her last night with something in his eyes that made her feel seen and valued and terrifyingly close to hopeful. I'm staying, she heard herself say, through winter, if you'll have me. Sarah's whoop of joy brought Tommy running from the bedroom, and suddenly Clara was engulfed in children, their arms around her waist, their voices overlapping in excitement. Over their heads she met James's eyes and saw relief and gratitude and something deeper that made her pulse quicken. Well then, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I better add to this supply list. We'll need extra of everything. The next weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. James worked dawn to dusk repairing fence lines, securing the barn, chopping enough wood to see them through months of cold. Clara threw herself into preserving everything the garden could still produce, pickling cucumbers, canning tomatoes, drying herbs and beans. Sarah helped enthusiastically, while Tommy carried firewood until his small arms ached. One afternoon, James came back from town with the wagon loaded with supplies and something extra wrapped in canvas. He carried it inside carefully, setting it on the table with a strange expression on his face. What is it? Sarah asked, immediately curious. James unwrapped the canvas to reveal a battered but functional sewing machine. Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile said her daughter got a new one, and she thought maybe... He looked at Clara uncertainly. Winter's long. I thought you might want something to occupy your time. And the children need new clothes. They're growing fast. Clara stared at the machine, her throat tight. It was a practical gift, justified by necessity, but it was also thoughtful, chosen specifically for her, assure her, anticipating her needs in a way that felt almost unbearably kind. Thank you, she managed. This is... Thank you. Can you teach me? Sarah asked eagerly. To use it? I can teach you, Clara promised, running her fingers over the machine's worn surface. She looked up at James. This must have cost... It was reasonable, he interrupted, and necessary. Don't make it more than it is. But it was more, and they both knew it. It was another tie binding her to this place, another thread weaving her into the fabric of this family. Clara should have been frightened by that. Instead, she felt something dangerously close to gratitude. That evening, a wagon arrived unexpectedly. James's sister Catherine and her husband Robert, their own wagon loaded with children and supplies. Catherine was older than James by several years, with the same dark hair and direct gaze, but a warmth that seemed more easily accessible. Thought we'd visit before the weather turns completely, Catherine announced, embracing James with fierce affection before turning to Clara. You must be Mrs. Brennan. James mentioned you in his last letter. Just Clara, please. Catherine studied her with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog everything in seconds. Well, Clara, I'm grateful to you. These two look better than they have in months. She gestured at Sarah and Tommy, who were already being swept up by their cousins. Over supper that night, The small house felt almost crowded with Catherine and Robert's 3 children added to the mix. But it was a good kind of chaos, filled with laughter and overlapping conversations, and the noise of life being lived fully. Clara found herself watching James with his sister, seeing a different side of him, more relaxed, quicker to smile, occasionally even laughing at Catherine's barbed commentary about their childhood. This was who he'd been before grief had carved away everything soft, she realized. This was the man Anna had fallen in love with. Later, while the men took the children outside to see the horses by lamplight, Catherine cornered Clara in the kitchen. "So," she said without preamble, "what's your story?" "I'm the hired help," Clara said evenly. "I cook, clean, mind the children." "That's your role. I asked about your story." Catherine dried a plate with efficient movements. "James doesn't trust easily, especially not with his children. But he trusts you. Why?" Clara considered deflecting, but something about Catherine's directness invited honesty. "Maybe because I don't want anything from him except fair pay for fair work." "Is that really all you want?" The question was gentle but penetrating. Clara's hand stilled in the wash water. "I don't know what you're asking." "I think you do." Catherine set down the plate. "I see how you look at them, at the children, at my brother, and I see how he looks at you when you're not watching. So I'm asking, what are your intentions?" "I don't have intentions," Clara said sharply. "I'm here because I needed work and he needed help. That's all." "That might have been all when you arrived. But it's not all anymore, is it?" Clara pulled her hands from the water, drying them roughly. "What do you want me to say? That I care about them? Fine. I do, more than I meant to, but that doesn't mean anything has to change. I can care about people without—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Without risking yourself," Catherine finished quietly. "I understand that impulse. I do. But Clara, life doesn't work that way. You can't control how much you care or when you care or what caring might cost you. You can only choose whether to run from it or lean into it." "You don't know what you're asking." "Don't I? I watched Anna die in that bed, watched my brother almost die from grief afterward. I know exactly what love costs. I also know what it gives." Catherine's voice softened. "Those children need you, and James, whether he'll admit it or not, needs you too. The question is whether you're brave enough to let yourself need them back." Before Clara could respond, the children burst back inside, bringing cold air and excitement about a barn owl they'd spotted. The moment passed, but Catherine's words lingered, uncomfortable and true. That night, lying in bed listening to the house settle around her, Clara thought about bravery. She'd been brave when she'd left her husband, brave when she'd started over with nothing, brave when she'd boarded that train to Wyoming. But this? Letting herself care, letting herself hope, letting herself imagine a future instead of just survival. This felt like a different kind of courage entirely, one she wasn't sure she possessed. The next morning, Catherine pulled Clara aside before they left. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to really hear it. That man in there is one of the best people I know. He's loyal and kind and steady as a mountain, but he's also terrified of wanting things because everything he's wanted has been taken from him. So if you're going to stay, stay all the way. Don't give him and those children hope just to snatch it away when things get difficult." "I'm staying through winter," Clara said. "I promised." "Winter isn't what I'm talking about, and you know it." Catherine's gaze was piercing. "I'm talking about after, about whether you'll let this be temporary or if you'll have the courage to make it permanent." They left before Clara could formulate a response, the wagon disappearing into the distance with waves and promises to visit again before the snow got too deep. James stood watching them go, his face thoughtful. "Catherine likes you," he said finally. "She wouldn't have interrogated you otherwise." "Is that what that was?" Clara asked dryly. "Knowing my sister, probably. She's protective." He turned to look at Clara directly. "What did she say?" Clara considered lying, but settled for partial truth. "She wanted to know my intentions." "And what are they?" It was the same question Catherine had asked, but coming from James, it felt weighted differently, more dangerous, more real. "I intend to do my job," Clara said carefully, "to keep my promises, to be here as long as I'm needed." "And when you're not needed anymore?" The question hurt more than it should have. "Is there a point you're trying to make, James?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. I'm trying to understand what we are to you, this place, these children, me. He took a breath. Because you matter to us, Clara. You're not just the hired help, no matter what you tell yourself. And I need to know if we matter to you too, or if you're just marking time until something better comes along. That's not fair, Clara said, her voice shaking. You asked me to stay through winter. You set those terms, not me. Now you're asking for more, and I don't know what more looks like or if I can give it. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, James said quietly. I'm just asking you to be honest. With me and with yourself. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild morning. I care about them, about Sarah and Tommy. They're good children and they deserve someone who cares. And me? The question was soft, almost tentative. Clara met his eyes and saw vulnerability there that matched her own. This man who'd lost everything, who'd learned to survive on stubbornness and determination, was asking her something that clearly terrified him. I don't know how to answer that, she whispered. Then don't. Not yet. He moved closer, not touching her but near enough that she could feel his warmth. I'm not asking you to have all the answers, Clara. I'm just asking you to be honest about the questions. Before she could respond, Tommy called from the house, needing help with something, and the moment broke. But as Clara walked back inside, she felt James's eyes on her back and knew that something had shifted between them. Something that couldn't be unshifted, no matter how much safer it would be to pretend otherwise. The days grew shorter and colder. First snow came on an October morning, just a dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning. James worked with increased urgency, and Clara matched his pace, determined that they'd be ready when winter truly arrived. One evening after supper, while the children were occupied with a puzzle James had carved for them, Clara found herself studying the main room with a critical eye. It was functional but sparse, showing the marks of a household that had stopped caring about comfort when grief moved in. What are you thinking? James asked, noticing her expression. This room needs warmth, not just heat, actual warmth, color, life. She gestured at the bare walls, the utilitarian furniture. We're going to be spending months trapped inside together. It should feel less like a prison. What did you have in mind? Over the next week, Clara transformed the space in small ways. She made curtains from fabric she'd brought from Kansas, cheerful yellow that caught what little autumn sun remained. She arranged Anna's quilts as decorative throws, honoring the dead woman's work by giving it prominence. She created a small library corner with the children's books displayed on a shelf James built. She even convinced him to move the furniture, opening up the space and making it feel less cramped. The children loved the changes, and even James admitted the room felt different, more like a home than a place where people simply existed. You have a gift for this, he said one evening, watching her arrange wildflowers she'd preserved in a jar. Making places feel lived in. Or maybe your place was just waiting for someone to care enough to try, Claire replied. The comment hung between them, meaning more than the words suggested. James started to say something, then stopped as Tommy appeared with a request for help with his reading. But later that night, Clara found a folded piece of paper slipped under her door. James's handwriting, careful and deliberate. Thank you for caring about the house, about the children, about all of it. You've given us back something I didn't realize we'd lost. J. Clara pressed the note to her chest, her eyes burning with tears she couldn't quite explain. She should be frightened by this, by the growing connection, by the way her carefully maintained distance was eroding day by day. Instead, she felt something closer to peace. The first major snowstorm hit in late October, burying the ranch in 2 feet of white silence. They were snowed in for 3 days, the world reduced to the small circle of warmth around the stove. Clara taught Sarah more advanced sewing techniques while Tommy learned his letters at the kitchen table. James carved more toys for the children and fixed everything in the house that had needed attention for months. On the second night, trapped by howling wind and driving snow, Tommy woke crying from a nightmare. Clara heard him from her room and was at his door before she'd fully thought about it. But James was already there, sitting on the edge of the bed, Tommy curled against his chest. I dreamed Mama came back, but she couldn't find us, Tommy sobbed. She was calling and calling, but we couldn't hear her. Your Mama knows where you are, James said quietly. his big hand gentle on his son's back. She's not lost, Tommy. She's at peace. But what if she's lonely? What if she's scared? Clara watched from the doorway, her heart breaking for this child who carried such impossible worries. Without thinking, she moved into the room and sat on the other side of the bed. "Can I tell you what I believe?" she asked softly. Tommy nodded against his father's chest. "I believe that people who love us don't want us to hurt for them. Your mama loved you so much. Sarah's told me stories. And I think if your mama could see you now, she'd want you to be happy, to laugh and play and live, not to spend your time worrying about her." "But I miss her," Tommy whispered. "Of course you do. Missing her means she mattered, means she was worth missing. That's not something to hide from." Clara reached out slowly, giving Tommy time to pull away if he wanted. When he didn't, she rested her hand on his small shoulder. "But you can miss her and still be happy. Those two things can live together." Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "Clara, if something happened to you, I'd miss you too." The simple statement hit Clara like a physical blow. She looked up and met James's eyes over their son's head. Their son, she'd thought instinctively, and the realization shook her. James's expression was gentle, understanding, as raw as she felt. "Nothing's going to happen to me," she said, her voice unsteady. "I'm right here. Promise?" She should equivocate, should remind him that nobody could promise forever. But looking at this frightened child who'd already lost so much, she couldn't offer anything less than what he needed. "I promise I'm not going anywhere, Tommy. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not for a very long time." Tommy's breathing gradually slowed, his small body relaxing into sleep again. Clara started to pull away, but James caught her hand, just briefly, just a squeeze of gratitude and something more. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, and when he released her, Clara could still feel the imprint of his touch. She returned to her room but couldn't sleep, her mind churning with implications she wasn't ready to examine. She'd just promised a child she wouldn't leave. Not temporarily, not with careful caveats, but simply and absolutely. And the terrifying part was that she'd meant it. Somewhere between arriving at this ranch and this moment, between keeping careful distance and holding a sobbing child through his nightmares, Clara had stopped being the hired help and become something else entirely. Someone who belonged here. Someone who mattered. Someone who was falling in love with a family that wasn't supposed to be hers. The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving the world transformed and brilliant with snow. James went out to check on the animals and dig paths to necessary buildings. Clara bundled the children in their warmest clothes and let them play in the drifts, their laughter bright against the white silence. She was inside making hot cocoa when James came back, stamping snow from his boots. His face was red with cold, but his eyes were warm. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Can you spare a few minutes?" Clara glanced at the children, who were still occupied with building a snow fort. "All right." She followed him to the barn, wondering at his mysterious tone. Inside, away from the children's hearing, he led her to the back corner where he'd set up a small workspace. On the bench sat a wooden box, simple but beautifully made, with a small brass latch. "I've been working on this," James said, suddenly uncertain. "It's not much, but I thought you should have a place for your things, private things. Something that's just yours." Clara lifted the lid carefully. Inside, the box was lined with fabric, scraps from the curtains she'd made, she realized, divided into small compartments, perfect for letters or keepsakes or all the small treasures a person accumulated. "James, this is beautiful." "I wanted you to have something that's yours," he said quietly. "In this house, in this place, something nobody else has claim to." She looked up at him, understanding the deeper meaning. He was giving her ownership, permanence, a tangible acknowledgement that she belonged here. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just keep it. Use it. Let it mean what it means." Clara set the box down carefully, her hands trembling. Then she did something she'd sworn she'd never do. She stepped forward and hugged him. Brief, careful, but real. James froze for just a second, then his arms came around her, warm and solid and safe. They stood like that for a handful of heartbeats, two broken people learning tentatively to trust in something that felt dangerously like healing. When Clara pulled back, She saw in his eyes everything she felt, hope and fear, and the terrifying possibility that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for this." "Thank you for staying," he replied, "for being here, for mattering." The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious, until Sarah's voice called from outside that they were freezing and needed cocoa immediately. Reality reasserted itself, but something fundamental had shifted. Clara knew it, James knew it, and neither of them was running away from it anymore. Winter deepened with a vengeance, burying the ranch under snow that turned the world into endless white, punctuated only by the dark shapes of buildings and fence posts. The isolation Clara had been warned about became reality. Days passed where they saw nothing beyond their small circle of warmth, heard nothing but wind and the creak of timbers and their own voices. But instead of the cabin fever James had cautioned her about, Clara found herself settling into the rhythm of it. The forced closeness that should have felt claustrophobic instead felt almost peaceful, like the four of them had become their own small world, complete and sufficient. She woke one December morning to find the house unusually quiet. The stove had gone cold in the night. She could see her breath misting in the gray dawn light. Clara dressed quickly, layering everything she owned, and emerged to find James already at the stove, coaxing reluctant flames from damp kindling. "Chimney's partially blocked," he said without looking up. "Snow must have drifted over it. I'll need to get up there and clear it, but the ladder's buried and the roof will be slick as glass." "That sounds dangerous." "Most things worth doing are." He finally got a flame to catch, feeding it carefully. "But we need heat, so there's not much choice in the matter." Clara moved to help, and they worked in companionable silence until the fire was strong enough to start warming the room. Sarah and Tommy remained asleep, their breathing audible through the thin walls. "James," Clara said quietly, "can I ask you something?" He looked up, wariness flickering across his face. "All right." "That first day, when you met me at the station, what were you expecting?" He sat back on his heels, considering the question. "Honestly, I wasn't expecting much. The agency woman said you were capable and desperate enough to take the job. I figured you'd last a few weeks, decide it was too hard, and leave like the others." He paused. "I didn't expect you to care about the house, the children, any of it. Most people just go through the motions. And now? Now I know I was wrong about you in every possible way." His eyes held hers, direct and honest. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Clara Brennan. And I don't just mean you work hard, though you do that too. I mean you came here carrying wounds that should have broken you, and instead of letting them make you bitter, you used them to understand my children's pain, to help them heal while you were still healing yourself." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm not that strong. Some days I'm barely holding together. That's what strength is. Not being unbreakable, just getting up every morning and trying again anyway." He stood, brushing soot from his hands. "I should tackle that chimney before the children wake." "Be careful," Clara said, meaning it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. He paused at the door, looking back at her. "I will. I've got reasons to be careful now." The implications of that statement warmed Clara more than the growing fire. She started breakfast, trying not to think about James on that icy roof, trying not to imagine all the ways things could go wrong. But her ears stayed tuned to sounds from outside, the scrape of the ladder, his boots on the roof, the reassuring normalcy of work being done. She was pulling biscuits from the oven when she heard it. A shout, a crash, then terrible silence. Clara's heart stopped. She ran for the door, barely remembering to grab a shawl, and burst out into the bitter cold. James was on the ground near the side of the house, the ladder toppled beside him, snow churned where he'd fallen. "James!" She reached him in seconds, falling to her knees in the snow. "James, talk to me!" He groaned, trying to sit up. "I'm all right. Just lost my footing." "Don't move. Where does it hurt?" "Everywhere," he admitted, then winced as he tried to shift. "Mostly my ribs and my arm." "Clara, I'm fine. Just help me up." "You're not fine. You fell off a roof." But she helped him anyway, supporting his weight as he struggled to his feet. His face went white with pain, and she felt him lean heavily against her. "Inside! Now!" She got him to the house and into a chair, then began carefully checking for injuries. His left arm was clearly the worst, swelling already visible, the way he held it speaking of significant pain. His ribs were badly bruised at minimum, possibly cracked, but nothing seemed broken beyond repair, and he was conscious and coherent. "You could have been killed," Clara said, her hands shaking as she wrapped his ribs with strips of cloth. "But I wasn't, just banged up a bit." "This is more than banged up, James. You need to rest. Let this heal properly." "Can't rest. Too much to do." Clara stopped, meeting his eyes directly. "You're going to rest even if I have to tie you to that chair. The children need you alive and whole, not worked to death trying to prove you're invincible." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because he nodded slowly. "All right. For today. But tomorrow? We'll see about tomorrow when tomorrow comes." Sarah and Tommy woke to find their father injured and Clara in charge. To their credit, they didn't panic. They simply stepped up. Sarah took over tasks she'd watched Clara do countless times, while Tommy fetched and carried without complaint. By noon, James was situated in the rocking chair with strict orders not to move, and the household was functioning despite his injury. But that night, after the children were asleep, Clara found James trying to bank the fire one-handed, his face gray with pain. "What are you doing?" she asked sharply. "Someone has to do it. Someone is doing it. Me. Now sit down before you hurt yourself worse." He sank back into the chair, breathing carefully around his damaged ribs. Clara finished with the fire, then turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked. "You're angry with me." "I'm not angry. I'm terrified." The admission came out before she could stop it. "When I heard you fall, when I saw you lying there in the snow—" Her voice broke. "I thought I'd lost you." The words hung between them, honest and raw. James was quiet for a long moment, then said softly, "Would that have mattered? If you'd lost me?" Clara's hands twisted in her apron. Every instinct screamed at her to deflect, to rebuild her walls, to protect herself from this dangerous conversation. But she was tired of protecting herself, tired of being afraid, tired of pretending she didn't feel what was so obviously growing between them. "Yes," she whispered, "it would have mattered. You matter." "Clara." He reached out with his good hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." She nodded, her heart hammering. "When Anna died, I thought that was it for me. I'd had my chance at love and lost it, and all that was left was surviving for the children's sake. I wasn't looking for anything else. Didn't want anything else." He took a breath. "And then you showed up at that station, all walls and wariness, and I thought you were just what I needed, someone competent who wouldn't ask for more than I could give." "James, let me finish." His grip tightened slightly. "But you were more than competent. You were kind and patient, and you saw my children, really saw them, and gave them what I couldn't. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as the hired help, and started thinking of you as—" He paused, searching for words. "As someone I wanted. Not to replace Anna. Nobody could do that, but as something new, something I didn't know I could still have." Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I don't know how to do this. How to want someone without being afraid of them. I know. And I'm not asking you to figure it all out tonight. I'm just asking if you think you could want this too. Eventually. When you're ready." He pulled her closer, gentle despite his injuries. "Could you see yourself staying, not as hired help, but as family, as mine?" The question should have terrified her. Instead, Clara felt something close to relief, like he was finally giving voice to things she'd been feeling but been too afraid to name. "I'm already yours," she said quietly. "I have been for weeks now, even though I kept pretending otherwise. The children are mine. This house is mine. And you—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "You're mine too, if you want to be." "I want to be," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to wake up every morning knowing you're here. Want to go to sleep every night with you beside me. Want to build a life with you that's ours, together." "I've never shared a bed with a man," Clara blurted out, the confession falling between them like a stone. "My husband, He took, but I never gave willingly, and I don't know if I can— Stop. James's voice was firm but gentle. I'm not asking for that. Not tonight, not tomorrow, not until you decide you want it. If you ever decide you want it. That's yours to give or not give, Clara. I won't take it from you. Tears spilled over, hot against her cold cheeks. How are you real? How can you possibly want me when I'm this broken? You're not broken. You're healing. There's a difference. He tugged her closer until she was kneeling beside his chair, their faces level. And I want you exactly as you are, with all your walls and your fears and your boundaries. I want all of it. Clara kissed him then, brief and tentative, but real. His lips were warm against hers, his good hand coming up to cup her face with devastating gentleness. It was nothing like the violent claiming her husband had called affection. This was a question, an invitation, something offered freely that she was equally free to accept or refuse. When she pulled back, James's eyes were bright. Was that all right? He asked. Yes. Clara's voice was steady despite her racing heart. It was more than all right. They sat there in the firelight, hands clasped, foreheads touching, while winter howled outside and the house creaked around them. Two broken people learning tentatively to trust in something whole. The days that followed James's injury passed in strange intimacy. Clara helped him dress and undress, her hands careful and professional as she tended his wounds. She saw him vulnerable in ways he'd never allowed before, and instead of making her uncomfortable, it made her feel trusted, valued. The children noticed the shift between them, though they didn't comment directly. But Clara caught Sarah watching them with a small, knowing smile, and Tommy started calling her our Clara instead of just Clara, a possessiveness that warmed her from the inside out. One evening, while James was resting and the children were occupied, Clara pulled out the wooden box he'd made her. She'd been using it to store small things: pressed flowers from the summer, the stones Tommy had given her, notes from Sarah about words she didn't understand. Now she added something new: the telegram that had brought her here, evidence of where this journey had started. Looking at it, she could barely recognize the desperate woman who'd signed those papers. That Clara had been running from everything, toward nothing except distance and escape. This Clara, the one who'd learned to love again despite every reason not to, felt like a different person entirely. What are you thinking about? James asked from the doorway, moving carefully but getting stronger each day. How far I've come. How different everything is from what I expected. He sat beside her, his injured arm still wrapped but healing well. Regrets? None that matter. She turned to face him. James, I need to tell you something. His expression grew cautious. All right. I want to stay. Not just through winter, not just until spring. I want to stay permanently, if you'll have me. But I need you to understand what that means. She took a breath. I can't promise I'll ever be comfortable with intimacy. I can't promise my fear will just disappear because I want it to. I can't promise I won't have days where I need distance and space and walls. I'm not asking for promises you can't make, James said quietly. I'm asking if you want to try. If you want to build something with me, knowing it won't always be easy, knowing we'll both mess it up sometimes. If you want us anyway. I want us, Clara whispered. I want this family and this life. And you. I want all of it, even when it's hard. James pulled something from his pocket, a folded paper that looked official. I went to town before I got hurt. Talked to the land office. This ranch. It's mine free and clear, no debt. But it felt wrong having only my name on it when you worked just as hard to keep it running. He unfolded the paper and Clara saw it was a deed. Her name had been added beside his, Clara Brennan Holloway, though they weren't married yet. Joint ownership, legal and binding. I can't offer you much, James said, his voice rough with emotion. Just a hard life in a difficult place with two children who need you and a man who's probably going to frustrate you more often than not. But it's yours if you want it, officially, legally, home. Clara stared at the document, her vision blurring. You added my name. I want you to feel secure, to know that even if something happens to me, you and the children will be taken care of. This is your home, Clara. I'm just making it official. She kissed him then, longer this time, deeper, letting herself feel the wanting without the fear. James held her carefully, mindful of his injuries, and when they parted, they were both breathing hard. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you have to, not because it's expected, but because you want to, because you want us to be family in every possible way." "Yes," Clara said, the word falling easily. "Yes, I'll marry you." They told the children at breakfast the next morning. Sarah squealed and threw her arms around Clara's neck, while Tommy grinned so wide Clara thought his face might split. The joy was uncomplicated, pure, the happiness of children who'd been waiting for the adults to catch up to what they'd known all along. "Can I call you Mama?" Tommy asked, suddenly shy. Clara's heart clenched. "You had a mama who loved you very much. I could never replace her." "Not replace," Tommy said seriously. "Just another mama. Is that allowed?" Clara looked at James, who nodded, his eyes bright. "That's allowed," she said softly. "If it's what you want." "It's what I want," Tommy said firmly, and crawled into her lap like he belonged there. Because he did. They all did. Winter began loosening its grip in late February, the days growing incrementally longer, the sun gaining strength. James and Clara were married on a clear March morning in the small church in Green River, with Catherine and Robert standing witness, and the children dressed in their best clothes looking proud enough to burst. Clara wore a simple dress she'd made herself, soft blue wool that brought out her eyes. Sarah had woven wildflowers into her hair, dried blooms saved from summer. It wasn't a grand wedding, but it was real and honest, and theirs. When the minister asked if she took James to be her husband, Clara said, "I do," without hesitation. And when James slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, Anna's ring, offered freely by Catherine, who said her sister-in-law would have wanted it, Clara felt like she was being welcomed into something larger than just marriage. She was being welcomed into a family, a history, a future. That night, in the room they now shared, James proved every promise he'd made. He didn't push, didn't take, didn't demand. He simply held her, patient and steady, until Clara made the first move. And when she did, when she finally trusted enough to cross that final boundary, it was nothing like what she'd known before. It was gentle and slow, and she could stop it at any moment, and he'd still love her tomorrow. She fell asleep in his arms, feeling safe for the first time in years, and woke in the early dawn still held close against his chest. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," James murmured against her hair. "Good morning," Clara whispered back and meant it. Spring came in full force, bringing with it work that kept them busy from dawn to dusk. But Clara threw herself into it joyfully, planting garden with Sarah, teaching Tommy his letters at the kitchen table, working alongside James to prepare for another year. One evening in late April, James came home with a surprise, a small printing press he'd bought from a newspaper that was upgrading equipment. "Thought we could start something," he explained. "Print up notices for the county, maybe a small newspaper. Give Sarah and Tommy skills they can use, give you a voice." Clara stared at the press, understanding what he was really offering: freedom, agency, the ability to create and communicate and be heard. This must have cost everything we had saved. "Worth it," James said simply. "You taught me that investing in people is never wasted." They set it up at the barn, and within weeks Sarah was setting type with careful precision while Tommy learned to operate the mechanism. Clara wrote small pieces about ranch life, about winter survival, about the quiet dignity of frontier existence. They printed notices and advertisements, and eventually a monthly newsletter that people from surrounding ranches began requesting. Years passed, marked by seasons and small triumphs. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's gentleness and Clara's practical strength. She became a teacher, riding circuit between ranch families, bringing education to children who couldn't access formal schooling. Tommy developed his father's quiet steadiness and Clara's way with words, eventually taking over the printing operation and expanding it into a legitimate business. The ranch prospered, not spectacularly, but steadily. James and Clara worked side by side, their partnership deepening into something that looked nothing like Clara's first marriage, and everything like what she'd never dared hope for: mutual respect, genuine affection, work shared equally. Clara never fully lost her wariness of intimacy, but with James's patience she learned that closeness didn't have to mean danger. That vulnerability could be a gift freely given rather than something taken by force. That love could be safe. One evening, 15 years after she'd first stepped off that train, Clara stood on the porch watching the sun set over land that was legally and emotionally hers. Sarah was visiting with her own students, Tommy was in town on business, James was finishing evening chores. The house behind her was warm and lived in, filled with years of memories and the comfortable clutter of lives well lived. James found her there, sliding an arm around her waist with the ease of long practice. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything. Nothing." Clara leaned into his solid warmth. "How grateful I am. How different my life could have been if I hadn't gotten on that train." "I'm grateful too," James said quietly. "You saved us, Clara. All of us. We were just surviving before you came. You taught us how to live again." "We saved each other," Clara corrected. "You gave me safety when I'd forgotten what that felt like. The children gave me purpose. This place gave me home." They stood together watching the sky turn gold and pink and purple. Two people who'd found each other in the aftermath of their separate disasters and built something beautiful from the ruins. The ranch spread around them, productive and peaceful. The children they'd raised together were thriving. The life they'd created was exactly what Clara had never known she needed, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. That night, sleeping beside her husband in the bed they'd shared for 15 years, Clara dreamed not of the past, but of the future. Of grandchildren, eventually. Of Sarah's students and Tommy's growing business. Of growing old on this land with this man who'd proven that patience and kindness could heal wounds she'd thought permanent. She'd come to Wyoming running from everything, toward nothing except survival. She'd stayed because of a promise to children who needed her, but she'd built a life here because of something simpler and more profound, because she'd learned to trust again, to hope again, to love again without fear turning that love into something ugly. The woman who'd once believed she'd never let another man close had spent 15 years sleeping beside one who'd never given her reason to regret it. The woman who'd thought herself broken beyond repair had discovered that broken things, carefully tended, could grow strong again. And the woman who'd arrived with one bag and a locked-up heart had filled a house with love and stayed through everything, stayed through storms and seasons, through hard winters and abundant springs, through all the quiet dailiness of a life well lived. She'd kept her promise. She'd stayed. And every morning when she woke in James's arms, with the sun rising over Wyoming territory and the sound of their children, grown now but forever theirs, somewhere in the distance, Clara Brennan Holloway knew with bone-deep certainty that staying had been the bravest and best decision she'd ever made. She was home. She was safe. She was loved. And she was no longer alone.